Well, hello again from the USA, from Alabama. We're having a beautiful day here as I'm about to begin once again studying with you from God's Word. We want to say hello to all of our friends and our spiritual family down in Guyana, and just express to you how much we appreciate these opportunities to be with you and to study God's Word. We're in the book of Daniel, and we want to continue that. This actually is going to be lesson number 9 in the series. Last week when I numbered the class, I called it lesson number 6, and it wasn't lesson number 6. It's supposed to be lesson number 8, and I just don't want us to be confused. We are in the 5th chapter of the book of Daniel. A lot of historical events have taken place that you can check in history that these things actually happened and are true. I think too often as we study something like Daniel, we study it from the standpoint of, boy, these are good stories, and we'll tell these to our children. But folks, it's more than that. It's more than just stories that we can share. They can be shared and should be shared. But these are actual events that took place in the lives of these people. It took place in the life of Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, of King Nebuchadnezzar and Belshazzar. These are all real people. And these events, transpired in their lifetime. Now, the New Testament tells us that those things that were written aforetime were written for our learning, that through patience and comfort of the Scriptures, we might have hope. Those things have been written so that we can look back at these things and know how God operated and how our predecessors remained faithful, and as they did, God blessed them. And the lesson that we learn from this is if we do the same thing, God's going to bless us. That's what this is all about. The thing under consideration, here in several of these chapters, is to make known to those people and to us that God rules in the affairs of men. He rules in the affairs of men today, just as he did during these particular times. And we can learn some valuable lessons. Now, we've learned how Nebuchadnezzar had to learn to humble himself before God. He was proud and shouldn't have been, and God wanted him to understand that he wasn't the one that built Babylon, but God worked through him in order to build Babylon. And Nebuchadnezzar had to learn that valuable lesson. And it wasn't until he, grazed like an animal out in the field that he realized this. And the text tells us when his sanity returned to him, he, acknowledged that God was in control. But then as, things progressed, his grandson is going to come to the throne. Now, Nabonidus, who was probably the son-in-law of Nebuchadnezzar, was king, and his son was Belshazzar. And Belshazzar was a co-regency with Nabonidus. And he, of course, is going to make some pretty terrible mistakes, one of which is he took those sacred items that were in the temple in Jerusalem that his grandfather Nebuchadnezzar had brought back to Babylon, and he was going to desecrate those. And he would do so by bringing them into the banquet room, and he and his wives and the noblemen that were there and the concubines all drank from these goblets and items. And the real problem was, as they did this, they were praising the gods of gold and silver and wood and stone and all of these different things. And God's going to let them know that this is unacceptable. And Belshazzar is going to learn, a powerful lesson, one that, eventually is going to cost him his life. Now, as we concluded last week in our study, we were talking about how these things that happened here with Belshazzar, these things were verified in archaeological discoveries, which makes these events recorded by Daniel as accurate historical events. And so we can put, a lot of credence in the fact that these things are true. Archaeology and history confirm the people and events, that had taken place. And this just gives us more security in knowing that what we read in the Bible and what God asks of us is true. And we are going to be able to, put great confidence in these things. Now, we looked at some of the archaeological discoveries that confirmed that, Nebuchadnezzar was king, that Nabonidus was king, and that Belshazzar was king. And all of these are verified by history. But now there's some other historical facts that are important about these particular writings. There's a lot of scholars, early scholars, who say that, Daniel was written during the time of the Greek Empire. But, a telling fact is that you don't have any references to the culture or the background of these great empires. They were unknown during this particular time period. They didn't know about Belshazzar. They didn't know about Nabonidus. And it was only later, several hundred years later, that these discoveries were made. And then the things in Daniel were proven to be accurate. Some of the ancient Near Eastern texts that had been records that, Cyrus, in taking the city of Babylon, and this is while the banquet was going on the inside, through various canals, he diverts the Euphrates River, and the water's driven off to, other places, and he's able to go into the city on the dry riverbed. And now why was this necessary? Because Babylon was surrounded by a 55.5-mile circumference of walls. And there were 2 walls, and these walls were 90 feet tall, each one of them, which means it was just impossible for people to scale those walls in order to get inside the city. So we have the historical facts that Cyrus, used the then Euphrates River. By diverting the waters, he could go under the walls and enter the city, and he could, conquer that city. And it's interesting that when we read from Isaiah chapter 44 and 45, he mentions Cyrus as, would be the one that would conquer the Babylonian Empire. And he calls him by name. He says Cyrus will do this. Well, this was 160 years before the event actually took place. Now, who in the world would be able to do that if they didn't have the omnipresent God who was giving them this information. You see, God had already seen these things. From the foundation of the world to the end of the world, God's already seen it. He's seen the whole thing unfold. He knows my life. He knows what I'm doing and what I'm going to do. Now, that doesn't change, the decision-making process that I have, because I don't know. But God, because He can see, He's omnipresent, He's everywhere at the same time, He can see these things and He can see these events. He knows your life. He knows the decisions you're going to make. He knows if you're going to remain faithful or if you're going to fall away. God knows that. Now, He's not going to make you do any of those things. In fact, He'll do what He can to keep you from falling away. But, God can know these particular things. Now, what happened with Belshazzar? Let's go to chapter 5, and let's look at verse number 5. It said, "Suddenly the finger of a human hand appeared and wrote on the plaster of the wall near the lampstand in the royal palace." Now, this is going to be important because archaeologists are going to discover these things, and they're going to mention them in their discoveries. He said the king watched the hand as it wrote. His face turned pale, and he was so frightened that his knees knocked together and his legs gave way. This man was scared to death, as many of us probably, would be if these same things were happening to us. Now, the things that transpire here could only be written by an eyewitness. Daniel was there. Daniel observed these things. He knows that they happened, and he wrote them down, in his epistle or in his letter, the book of Daniel, and refers, back to these things. Now, the king does what he's always done. He's going to call for, his men that should have the ability to interpret these things. Verse number 7 says, the king called out for the enchanters, astrologers, and diviners to be brought, and said to these wise men of Babylon, whoever reads this writing and tells me what it means will be clothed in purple and have a gold chain placed around his neck, and he will be made the third highest ruler in the kingdom. The purple robe, the gold chain, all of these were signs of royalty. And what Belshazzar is saying, if you can, interpret these things, then you're going to be like royalty. We're going to make you the third person in the kingdom. In verse number 8 of Daniel 5, he says, then all the king's wise men came in, but they could not read the writing or tell the king what it meant. So King Belshazzar became even more terrified, and his face grew even more pale. His noblemen were baffled. They couldn't tell him what was going on. Well, that scared him even more than what he was before. And he's wanting, to know what this interpretation is. And nobody, those who they counted on to do interpretation of things, the astrologers, enchanters, they couldn't tell him. So when we get down to verse number 10, it says the queen, hearing the voices of the king and his nobles, came into the banquet hall. Now, this is not the wife of Belshazzar, but most likely this is the queen mother. She was probably the daughter of Nebuchadnezzar and married to Nabonidus. And she was what we would call the queen mother. And she comes in and she says, "O king, live forever." That's a popular greeting when you come into the presence of the king. Unfortunately, he's not going to live forever. She said, "Don't be alarmed. Don't look so pale. There is a man in your kingdom who has the spirit of the holy gods in him. in the time of your father, grandfather in actuality, he was found to have insight and intelligence and wisdom like that of the gods. King Nebuchadnezzar, your father the king, I say, appointed him chief of the magicians, enchanters, astrologers, and diviners. This man Daniel, whom the king called Belteshazzar, was found to have a keen mind and knowledge and understanding, and also the ability to interpret dreams, explain riddles, and solve difficult problems. Call for Daniel, and he will tell you what the writing means. So the Queen Mother recognized that, Daniel had the ability to do these things. Now, Daniel, when he was asked, back earlier to interpret a dream, did not take the ability upon himself. When asked who could do this, he said, nobody can, but there is a God that will be able to do this. And this was the humility of God's servant Daniel. He didn't say, boy, look at me, I'm able to do all these things. He said, no, God is the one that is able to do the interpretation. So in verse number 13, it says, so Daniel was brought before the king, and the king said to him, are you Daniel, one of the exiles my father the king brought from Judah? I have heard that the spirit of the gods is in you, and that you have the insight, intelligence, and outstanding wisdom. The wise men and enchanters were brought in before me to read this writing and tell me what it meant, but they could not explain it. Now I have heard that you're able to give interpretations and to solve difficult problems. If you can read this writing and tell me what it means, you will be clothed in purple and have a gold chain placed around your neck, and you will be made the third highest ruler in the kingdom. So the same promise now is being made to Daniel that was made to all of these other wise men. If you can do this, you're going to be the third highest person in the kingdom of Babylon. Now we say, why the third? We mentioned this last week. Third highest because there were already two. There was Nebuchadnezzar, and then there was Belshazzar. And these were already reigning, and Daniel could not be put in their place, but he could, be the next in line. And that would be number 3 in the kingdom. And so he will, become the third ranking person in the kingdom of Babylon. Now, in verse number 18, he's reminding them of what, happened with his father. Start with verse 17. It says, then Daniel answered the king, you may keep your gifts for yourself and give your rewards to someone else. Daniel said, I don't want them. Give them to somebody else. Nevertheless, I'll read the writing for the king, and I'll tell him what it means. So Daniel is consenting to the fact, I'll tell you what all of this means. But I don't have to have your gold chain, your purple robe, or be made the third in line in the kingdom of Babylon. Then in verse number 18, Daniel says, O king, the Most High God gave your father Nebuchadnezzar sovereignty and greatness and power and splendor. Because of the high position he gave him, all the peoples of the nation and men of every language dreaded and feared him. He's a powerful king. And as such, everybody feared him and was afraid. Said those the king wanted to put to death, he put to death. And those he wanted to spare, he spared. Those he wanted to promise or promote, he promoted. And those he wanted to humble, he humbled. But when his heart became arrogant and hardened with pride, he was disposed from his royal throne and stripped of his glory. So Daniel is reminding Belshazzar of what happened to Nebuchadnezzar. That, this, because he was prideful, which apparently Belshazzar is in what he is doing with these sacred objects that came from the temple in Jerusalem. And what he's saying is, I can read this, but keep in mind what happened to your grandfather. Verse number 21, it says he was driven away from people and given the mind of an animal. He lived with the wild donkeys and ate grass like cattle, and his body was drenched with the dew of heaven until he acknowledged that the Most High God is sovereign over the kingdoms of men and sets over them anyone he wishes. Now, what Daniel is saying to King Belshazzar, God is the one that's in control. He's the one that puts you on this throne. He's the one that can take you off of this throne. Now, that's a lesson, we need to learn in our society today. God rules in the affairs of men. God is in control. And that's why Jesus said we render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's and unto God the things that are God's. As long as what I do in rendering obedience to my president or, to the one that governs my country, as long as it doesn't contradict the law of God, then I'm to obey it. Now, when it comes in conflict, like when Peter and the others were before the Sanhedrin, and they said, don't you preach anymore in the name of this Jesus. Peter says, we can't do that. We have to obey God rather than men. So they were given an instruction not to do these things, but they said, we have to do it. And we have to do it because that's our number one obligation, is to make sure that we obey God, because he's sovereign over all nations and over all kingdoms. Verse number 22, he says, but you, his son, O Belshazzar, have not humbled yourself, though you knew all of this. So Belshazzar had seen what had happened. He knew that Nebuchadnezzar had been stricken of his kingship and was put out to pasture, so to speak. And yet he knew that it was because he wouldn't humble himself, and yet he's doing the same thing. Verse 23, instead, you have set yourself up against the Lord of heaven. You had the goblets of his temple brought to you, and you and your nobles, your wives and your concubines, drank wine from them. You praised the gods of silver, gold, of bronze, iron, wood, stone, which cannot see or hear or understand. But you did not honor the God who holds his hand, your life, and all your ways. Therefore, he sent the hand that wrote the inscription. Now, because he would not humble himself and was giving praise to these gods of wood and stone and gold and silver and iron and all of these things, he was displeasing God. And this is why God sends the one that's going to write, on the wall, these particular things. And I think it's interesting, and we'll learn this when we get into our next lesson. We'll look at what was written and what the interpretation of that is. But we're also going to understand from this that even minute mentions, like the finger wrote on the plaster of the wall near the lampstand, that when archaeologists uncover these things, they're going to make reference to the fact that these were scratches in the plaster, which was over close to the lampstand. So what God says in inspiration should give us, confidence in the fact that these events were events that God was in charge of, and we need to learn from it. Belshazzar, like his grandfather, would not humble himself, but he lifted himself up in pride, and because of that, he was going to be removed from his position. Now, I may not ever be a king, or I may never be a president. In fact, I can just about guarantee that, because one, I'm not going to run for president, but I may not be important in a lot of other ways. And that is not really the important thing anyway. Even in where I am in life, I'm just below a nobody. If I lift myself up in pride, then I can expect some of these same things to happen to me. Pride goes before destruction, a haughty spirit before a fall. So folks, we got to be careful. Don't be prideful, because when pride creeps into our lives, we can rest assured that God is not going to bless us. So valuable lessons here in chapter 5. Now when we get together next time, we'll finish chapter 5 and we'll get over into chapter 6 and look at another one of these things that sometimes we think, isn't that a great story for children? And that's Daniel in the lion's den. But we'll get into all of those things when we get together next time. I hope you have a great day today. I hope you have a great day of worship. I hope you have a great day of fellowship with one another. And when we get together again, we'll continue our study in Daniel. Until then, may the good God of heaven bless you and keep you.